to finish their stuff. Okay, well, good evening. My name's Tim Holden. Shahriar has invited me in my role in the Oxfordshire Buddhist group to talk to you tonight about Buddhism, about whether Buddhism is a religion or a philosophy. Just one thing to say about me is that I'm not a scholar, I'm not an expert in Buddhism, I'm not a monk, and I wouldn't really call myself a layman either. I think the way I describe myself would be as a sincerely practicing Buddhist, so it's very much in that capacity that I'm coming to you tonight. The talk I intend to give will be something of a flavour of Buddhism from an experiential point of view. So maybe not so much theory, more my own experience. So I will talk for a bit about just what I see Buddhism as, how it relates to terms like religion and philosophy, and then say, just look in a bit more depth at what I consider to be the principles of Buddhism. And then at the end, hopefully we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers. I can't promise I'll be able to answer all of them, but I'll certainly take them away with me. So, the title of the discussion is something like Buddhism, a religion or a philosophy, a talk on the nature of Buddhism, the nature of religion. And this reminds me a little bit of a story in the Buddhist tradition. The story is set in China in about the 5th or 6th century CE. About the time when Buddhism is starting to become quite popular in China, particularly amongst the more educated classes, the intellectual elites of China. And it's around this time that an Indian monk, who's travelled presumably by foot from India to China, shows up in the town where the Emperor of China is living. And the Emperor, naturally, given the popularity of Buddhism, wants to invite this man to come and speak and to hear him. So you can sort of imagine the scene, with all the regalia of the court of the Emperor of China, and this sort of little Indian monk, probably dressed in a robe fashioned out of refuse rags. So there's quite a sort of juxtaposition there, quite a contrast. And of course the Emperor of China and all his courtiers, very much steeped in Confucianism, Taoism, sort of quite philosophically minded. And so the Emperor of China asks Bodhidharma, he asks the monk, what is the essence of Buddhism? And Bodhidharma says, cease to do evil, learn to do good, purify the heart. Cease to do evil, learn to do good, purify the heart. And the Emperor of China is unimpressed, to say the least. He says, that's so simple, even a child of 4 could understand it. Obviously, he was expecting some philosophical treatise. And Bodhidharma says, yes, but so difficult that even a man of 80 cannot put it into practice. Okay, so that's sort of, in a way, this prefaces my talk, because I think there's a few things we can draw from that. Firstly, that sometimes in conveying Buddhist ideas, there's a semblance of simplicity to it. Sometimes things come across almost like truisms. And perhaps for that reason we tend to ignore them. So we need to be quite careful about drawing premature and superficial conclusions about Buddhism based on something like a talk given in an hour or 45 minutes or so. Really, to find out what the nature of Buddhism is, one actually needs to try it out to some extent. One needs to find out what is meditation, give it a go. What does Buddhism mean by ethics? And try that out. And kind of, on the basis of that, the nature of Buddhism emerges. So, given that, so what I will say in the rest of the talk is very much in that context. So, I will define my terms. Firstly, I'll just look at the word Buddhism, which I'm not sure whether you're aware, is a real anachronism. I think it originated in something like the 19th century, maybe 1816, something like that, in the Asiatic Journal. So Buddhism, or what we've come to call Buddhism, was going quite merrily on its way for about 23 centuries before the word Buddhism arose. And we need to just be aware that the word Buddhism is likely to sort of carry connotations for us, which may not necessarily point us in the direction of what this phenomenon is. So what's the word Buddhism made out of? Well, it's presumably made out of the word Buddha, which is a title. It means the awakened one. And ism. So it's the sort of ism of the awakened one. So that's what we can draw from Buddhism itself. But in the East, I think, probably even to this day, but certainly in history, Buddhism has been simply known as the Dharma. And I'll unpack what that means as well. So Dharma is one of those Sanskrit words which has probably hundreds of different meanings, ranging from something like a sort of teaching, or a law, in the sense of the law of gravity, something like that, a general law. It could mean a principle. It can mean the truth or reality. It can also mean a thing. So, a dharma is another way that the word is used. So, what this is connoting is a sense of the teachings or the principles, or you could say the practices as well, which arrive at an insight into the way things are, an insight into reality. So that's very much the way I will be using the word Buddhism, and I will use that word. But I think one of the things about the word Buddhism is it can sound a lot like a school of thought, particularly the ism bit. And I think this is probably one of the reasons why it tends to be thought of in some circles as a philosophy. And the allegiance to philosophy is not all that inappropriate, in the sense that philosophy means love of wisdom. The etymology of philosophy means love of wisdom. But in my experience of philosophy, I did an undergraduate degree in philosophy. In my experience of it, very much this idea of wisdom is one of coming up with an account of reality, say a logically consistent account of reality. So primarily, philosophy, at least in the Western sense, although maybe this is a moot point, is concerned with propositions, with ideas, their relations between one another, and the relation of those ideas to the world. So it's quite a sort of abstract phenomenon, philosophy, at least in the way I've experienced it myself. And certainly Buddhism does put forward ideas, so you'll have things like impermanence, or unsatisfactoriness, or insubstantiality, words which have a philosophical flavour to them. Ideas are very important in Buddhism. But there's a sense in which Buddhism goes further than just whether these ideas relate to one another consistently or whether they correspond with reality. There's a sense which I put in the difference between, say, knowing something to be the case and that sinking in. So Buddhism is very much concerned with that knowledge kind of permeating into our emotions, our behaviour, and our sort of way of seeing the world. So it's not something you can do on a 9-to-5 level. One has to, from the point of view of a Buddhist, one has to take things on to heart. But having said this, even saying this, certainly clear and analytical thinking is absolutely essential in Buddhism. So in the sense of using ideas well, thinking clearly, this is a very prominent aspect of Buddhism. It's interesting that in certain spiritual circles, certain rather fashionable spiritual circles, there's a sort of poo-pooing of the intellect. Sort of saying, that's all in your head. Well, okay, to some extent, an overemphasis on the intellect is a problem. Or it can be one-sided. But we need to have that. And I think this is one of the things that comes out of an acquaintance with the Buddha's teaching is that the Buddha really is very clear about what his teaching is and what it's not. So when the Buddha was teaching in India 2,500 years ago, there were lots of other wandering ascetics, wandering philosophers and so on, who were all propounding their own views on reality and their own practices. And the Buddha was very clear in differentiating what his teaching was from others. But that wasn't so much a point of sectarian prejudice. It was far more to do with the Buddha having arrived at a particular insight and knowing what does and what doesn't lead to that insight. And as Buddhists, as I am myself and as others are, I think you can't stress how important it is to be able to recognise the difference between what is the path and what isn't the path. Or, what are practices that are helpful or what are practices that are unhelpful. So one doesn't necessarily need to be all that erudite either. You don't necessarily have to accumulate too much knowledge about Buddhism in order to do this. You just need to be clear. Well, what is the Buddha teaching and how can I use that? So in the sense of philosophy, well, Buddhism does have a certain affinity with philosophy. It uses philosophy, but that's not the end of it. That's not the end of the story. So now what about religion? So in terms of defining the word here, I went to the dictionary, and the first definition is a belief in a superhuman controlling power. A belief in a superhuman controlling power. I.e. God, i.e. A creator, sustainer, protector and judge of the world and humanity. And it's worth saying just at the very beginning that this conception of God has no role in Buddhism. So this doesn't feature in the Buddha's teaching at all. Maybe we can talk a bit about that in the discussion if you like. The second definition I came across was a system of faith and worship. And I think that there is a certain amount one could say about this, which is true of Buddhism. So in particular, and in light of the absence of a controlling power, a superhuman controlling power, it might seem odd to external observers of Buddhism that there's a presence of ritual, there's a presence of things like chanting, collective devotion, a sort of aesthetic sense as well, the building of beautiful shrines. So it might seem there's a certain contradiction there, perhaps. But worship is a very central part of Buddhism, and that devotional side is a very central part of Buddhist practice. And this is for two reasons, as far as I can glean from the Buddhist tradition. The first of which is that emotions such as reverence, receptivity, inspiration, in a way a relation to something, a desire to connect with something higher, is in itself something very, very valuable. I think the Buddhist tradition would go as far as to say it's an essential part of being a happy human being, to have that sort of reverence for something higher. And the second consideration is that generally these emotions are cultivated better in a collective setting. So perhaps a psychologist might say these emotions become amplified when combined with synchronous activity or with music or with aesthetic beauty. I think, the way I see it is it's just more fun to do things like that. You just get more out of it, you feel like you get more out of it. So worship and devotion from the point of view of a Buddhist is nothing to do with propitiating God, it's nothing to do with sort of bribing your way to heaven or bribing your way to enlightenment or anything like that. It's more about supporting a connection with our ideal, supporting a connection between our understanding of where we want to go and our emotions. Yeah, so I'll say a little bit more about this later on in terms of the emotions, but Yeah, and this relates to some extent with what I said about philosophy, this idea of things sinking in. It's not, in a way, enough to have an idea about what you want to be like. You've got to be motivated to do that. You know, we know that in the case of exercise. We might know that exercise is very good for us, but we might not necessarily do it because the motivation's not there. So this kind of aspect of ritual and devotion in Buddhism is very much about bringing the emotions on board and bringing a motivation to engage further with our practice. And what about faith? Well, faith is a little bit of a strange word to use, and it certainly has confusing connotations for people when used in a Buddhist context. It's certainly not blind faith, and a lot of people kind of go to real lengths to point out that you're not subscribing to anything. In a sense, it's beyond one's experience. You're not saying something which is contrary to your experience. Rather, faith tends to translate two different emotions. So the first one is, to some extent, at the beginning of one's practice. It's more like a willingness to try something out. So faith, in this sense, is a receptivity to advice, and it's got to be critical. You know, it's not an uncritical acceptance of teaching, but it's critical with an eye to what is the truth in this. You know, what can I really take from this teaching? And the second case in which the word faith is used in a Buddhist setting is, it more literally translates as a confirmed confidence. So this is having put into practice the teachings that one has heard, seeing that it works. Having just a confidence that it works and seeing the difference that it's made to your life. Now, there's quite a fashion amongst certain Buddhist schools of thought to say there's no such thing as faith or even belief in Buddhism at all. It's become quite a popular movement. But I think this is an extreme view. On the basis of what I've said before, I think there are elements of faith in Buddhism. The extreme view says something like it's just practices. Buddhism consists solely of doing things, solely of practices. But in a sense, we need to believe that those practices work. It's not enough just to have those practices and be told to do them. We need to have, firstly, a belief that they will at least maybe come out with something in the end. But we also need to understand what the principles are which underlie those practices. And what principles make this possible. So I've sort of covered to some extent what I want to say about whether Buddhism is a religion or a philosophy. Possibly things will come out in the discussion afterwards. But the way I see it at the moment anyway is that religion and philosophy are sort of near misses. You can talk about Buddhism as a religion, you can talk about it to some extent as a philosophy, but to do so you need to employ quite a lot of qualifications, quite a lot of sort of caveats. It's not straightforward that it's either one or the other. Okay, I'm just going to take a pause there and have a sip of water. So what I'm going to talk about now are three principles which underpin Buddhist practice. So they're sort of principles which maybe on the face of it seem quite straightforward. Maybe they seem almost like truisms. What I'm going to suggest is actually that there's something much deeper to it, and in fact that Buddhist practice consists in, to some extent, the deepening of these, of the understanding into these principles. And that these principles kind of point to a very alternative way of living, both in relation to ourselves, in relation to others, and in relation to the wider world as well. So the first principle is sort of an answer to the question, where does happiness come from? I'll use the word happiness, and I won't define that quite yet. And this principle is sort of based on the observation that when we act upon a particular intention, it has the effect of strengthening it. So when I have an impulse to do something and I act on that impulse, it encourages that impulse to arise in future. So, for example, I'm walking along the street and somebody's collecting for a charity and I have an impulse to give something. Now if I get out my wallet and put something in there, that encourages me, that sort of sets up the conditions to make it easier for me to give in future. And similarly with things like awareness. So with meditation, which is a sort of conspicuously Buddhist practice, what we're doing, and I was saying this a little bit to Shahriar earlier, is we take something like the breath as an object of focus, and we soon find that our mind will wander onto something else. Inevitably it will, at least in the beginning. And we say to ourselves, okay, let me bring my mind back to the breath. Let me bring my mind back to the raw experience of breathing. And I set an intention. And in doing that, and particularly with meditation, one does it maybe hundreds of times in the course of a single meditation session. One reinforces, one strengthens that intention to keep bringing our awareness back to our present experience. It really strengthens that awareness. And the same goes for almost any positive quality, and the negative qualities as well. But Buddhism particularly emphasises things like generosity, kindness, awareness, confidence, energy, even intelligence to some extent. We can act on an intelligent motive, and that encourages us to do so further down the line as well. But generally these qualities I've sort of very broadly labelled with the somewhat nebulous term happiness. But this is, for the Buddhists, to some extent what happiness consists of. It's these attitudes which take us beyond our sort of narrow self-concerns, attitudes which open us up to new experiences, to experiences beyond our sort of opinions, beyond our prejudices, and attitudes which open ourselves up to the needs of others and the lives of others as well. So maybe that doesn't seem all that controversial, I don't know. I was talking to my girlfriend about this recently, and she's got a psychology background, and she was saying, well, that's just reinforcing. I don't know very much about psychology, but I take it that it seems to be something, almost a truism. But in a sense, it's something which is quite antithetical to the majority of what we're told. Even from a very young age. Very often we're told that happiness consists in having things. So having this qualification, or having this house, or this car, or this partner, or just a sort of location of happiness outside of ourselves. So and it's from the Buddhist point of view, this is perverse. It's saying that happiness is almost a quality of the object, but it's not. It's a quality of the subject. And in fact, in trying to locate happiness elsewhere, what one finds is that one becomes increasingly alienated from it, which is great for business, I suppose, but not so good for mental health, and not so good for our sense of fulfillment, our sense of well-being. I really think this is quite a radical thing that Buddhism is saying, and certainly points out a way of. Sort of a way towards our well-being, which is easily accessible to us and free as well. It has the benefit of being just right in front of us. So that's the first principle that I'm going to throw out for discussion for how Buddhist practice works, or what underpins it. And the second one, maybe it's more controversial, and we'll see. The second one is that this process has no upper limit. So this process of acting upon an intention of awareness, it just keeps on growing. If one continues to do it, one becomes more and more aware. There is no, as it were, sort of a priori ceiling on our awareness, on our kindness, on our generosity, on our creativity. And this is quite an interesting one, because I do find that there's some resistance to this when I've talked to people about it. I remember in a couple of instances being asked about Buddhism and being asked about the Buddha, and people would say things like, but the Buddha was just a man, wasn't he? Or the Buddha was only a human being. And I sort of, that's an interesting view. Where's this just coming from? Where's this only a human being coming from? This is a view which is not present in Buddhism. The view in Buddhism is, or the teaching in Buddhism, you could say, is that one can continue to develop without end. That it just gets better and better. In a sense, the Buddhist tradition says that, and it's not. This isn't canonical. This is my gloss. It says that to some extent we are limited only by our imaginations of what we're capable of, which is an extremely positive vision, I think, very positive vision, and something which maybe we don't agree with wholeheartedly. But if we can tap into something of that spirit, it seems to open up things for us quite a bit in what we do. Another way of putting it would be to say, whatever situation we find ourselves in, there's a next step. There's a way beyond it, and it might be that we find ourselves in a very wretched state, maybe in a state of a lot of pain or a lot of hate, a difficult position. Well, Buddhism says actually there's a next step. We can go beyond this. We can, but by acting on our intentions, we can take ourselves further. We can take it out of this situation. Equally, we might find ourselves in a very pleasant situation, a very, very cushy number. And Buddhism says, well, we can go beyond that as well. The pleasure doesn't pleasure doesn't stop. We can continue with that. I'd be interested to hear what you have to say about that. In a sense, this has another element to it as well. That it's not just that there's no upper limit for the individual, there's no outer limit as well. And if you think about these qualities as one develops them, they spread. They have an ability to be communicated very easily to other people. One might even say that developing these qualities is the basis for genuinely altruistic activity. I mean, there's quite a lot of doing good in the world. But how much of that doing good is genuinely in response to people's needs? One of the things about particularly awareness and kindness in a Buddhist sense, which I might talk about more, is that it's specifically being open to the needs of others and developing a greater capacity for response to those needs. So a capacity to respond practically as well as emotionally, appropriately. So this second principle, this process in a sense continues to unfold, both for oneself and for others. Okay, the third principle that I'm going to air is that friendship is the context of the spiritual life. So that this process of developing ourselves, developing these positive qualities, takes place in the context of friendship with one another, friendship with other practitioners. And the realisation of the importance of this is quite a relatively new phenomenon for me. It's quite a new thing. Certainly, I started meditating aged 16, just after I finished my GCSEs. I've got a book. I learned to meditate on my own. And I don't think I even spoke to another meditator for years, or for 3 or 4 years. I was very much a sort of isolated individual, well, individualist, I think is probably the way I would put it. And in a certain sense, I was quite alienated from support. I think maybe there are some things about it. This isn't so much a sob story; it's just a story. So, in the sense of, I remember when I was 13 or 14, something like that. We were doing an exercise in school. It was a lesson on careers. So we had these booklets, and the book